Australia is one of the world's largest producers of coal. It's the country's main source of electricity. The industry employs around 60,000 people and exports are worth about $40 billion annually. But mining towns fear they will be left behind in the global shift towards renewables. Some communities in Australia are even taking climate action into their own hands and turning away from coal completely. Nestled between the trees and hilltops of Australia's Great Dividing Range, Yakandanda's residents are on the way to powering their town entirely by renewable energy by 2025.
At the moment we've got 3 microgrids, a mini grid, a virtual power plant which is a network of 10 public buildings with solar and some of them with batteries.
Residents like Juliet Milbank are making the switch on their own, while they believe most of the country lags behind. It's taken nearly a decade and they've leaned on technology, donations and several volunteers to help lay the foundations. "60% of homes here now have solar power, compared to the national average of 1 in 5.
For us, I reckon it's really just knowing that we're doing our bit to not rely so much on the coal-fired power stations to power what we do in our house.
This is what Miss Jones, along with 2 million Australian households, are shifting away from: coal. In the Hunter Valley in New South Wales, coal is the economic heart of the region. The sound of a coal train echoes throughout the streets up to 40 times a day.
We got the news on Monday that the Independent Planning Commission has approved the expansion of the local mine here.
Michael White worked as a mining engineer for most of his life. This 200-acre property is his livelihood and his children's childhood. They moved here 20 years ago to work in the mines, but now the mines are taking over.
They are going to move from being currently about 5 kilometres away from us to a minimum of 2.5 kilometres. That's twice as close.
The sorts of things that we saw were a visible increase in dust levels. Our kids would walk across the lawn when the lawn was wet and they'd have black feet. It would be black in the bottom of our swimming pool. We still can fill a bathtub up here when we're bathing our grandchildren and the water is grey. And the amount of exposed ground and mining that's going on and the air quality, quite simply, it's horrific.
Okay, and just big breaths for me. In and out.
Dr. Bob Vickers has seen firsthand how the presence of open-cut coal mines affects people's health.
The stories of the people that live near the mines are really distressing to hear. Look, we take 20,000 breaths a day. Every breath we take, there's some air pollution in that, and it's going into our lungs, it's going into our bloodstream, it's doing the damage. This is one of our air quality monitoring stations. This is what's monitoring our coarse particle pollution, our sulphur dioxide and our nitrogen dioxide.
All around this region, there are these air quality monitors that send out alerts when nearby coal mines cause harmful levels of pollution. Studies have shown that those alerts are sent out far too often. More than 16% of 2 to 14-year-olds have asthma in this region. That's compared to 10% of 0 to 14-year-olds nationally. Nathan Clements has been employed in coal mining workshops in the Hunter Valley region of New South Wales since he left school. His father was a miner and most of his friends work in the industry. He fears his hometown will be left behind in the renewable energy revolution.
This is all I've really known for years. It's all my family's really known for a long time. If the gates were just to close up tomorrow, mass unemployment, probably a lot of people are going to default on their mortgages. I would say loss of income. A lot of people would probably move away in the long term because the work here is just not enough.
As Mr. Clements turns to studying commerce to get out of the game completely, a Japanese-Australian consortium has plans to turn coal into part of the solution by extracting hydrogen from it.
To do that, we pulverise the coal into fine particles. We then add oxygen and gasify it at high temperature and pressure. We then refine it to get pure 99.999% hydrogen.
In a world first, the hydrogen will be liquefied, then shipped to Japan. They'll capture the CO2 produced in the process and store it off the Australian coast. If they can prove it's commercially viable, they'll save 1.8 million tonnes of CO2 emissions per year, the equivalent of around 50,000 cars. The decisions about clean energy and fossil fuels also have consequences for Australia's environment, including the Great Barrier Reef. Scientists warn it's under siege from global warming, with the sun scorching corals that are thousands of years old. The ability for this reef ecosystem, as well as our economic and human health systems to survive, will depend on the decisions we make today.
The US state of Alaska is on the front lines of America's fight against climate change. It's dealing with the effects of it like no other place in the country, in a very oversized way, and trying to tackle the multiple and diverse climate-related issues across an area that spans 2 million square kilometres creates some very big challenges in a very big state. There are challenges faced in rural Alaska, where dog sledding is still part of everyday life. Mayum Osmar is the only Vietnamese musher in the state. She's my guide as we whip through the forests of the Kenai Peninsula.
Well, at first I'm very scared and very nervous. I crashed a lot. But after that I'm very confident. You know, I feel so free. You run a dog. You don't care about anything else, just a dog and you.
Her husband Dean became an overnight celebrity here when he won the annual Iditarod in 1984. It's a grueling 1,500-kilometre solo journey, just the musher and their dogs battling blizzards in -50 Celsius temperatures, traversing southern Alaska over a 10-day journey. But temperatures are warming here at least twice as fast as in the rest of the US. And in recent years, the warmer weather has forced a change in the race route, originally set in 1973.
Because of the warm temperatures, maybe not enough snow, or maybe some of the streams or rivers weren't quite frozen up on the lower part of the race. Well, you don't want to keep having races that have an asterisk behind them. You would like to have just be a real Iditarod on the original route. Yeah, we don't have ourselves don't have much control over that, so we're just all hoping that it remains the same and stays a good quality race.
For Mayum and Dean and thousands of other mushers, there's much more that's at stake than simply sledding. This is a way of life, a livelihood, a sport, a tradition, but it's now under threat, and that's a pattern that's playing out across much of Alaska. 4 times the size of Japan, large enough to fit Singapore into it more than 2,000 times, Alaska dominates in both size and scale. But in these vast landscapes, it's individual people who are bearing the brunt of rising temperatures.
As we see the whole landscape changing, it is really impacting our way of life.
Leanna Hefner works with hundreds of different groups, all helping communities affected by climate change. Rural, often native areas are the hardest hit. Their reliance on wild game and fish to survive is in jeopardy.
It's all connected. So when you have, say, the entire Yukon River watershed changing, where water temperatures, for example, are rising, that impacts, for example, the salmon throughout the entire watershed, over 1,000, plus miles from the Yukon River Delta all the way up over into Canada.
Sea levels are rising and coastal erosion is pushing communities inland. And rising temperatures are pushing wildlife further north in search of colder areas. Plus, Alaska's been hit with more unprecedented, unpredictable weather. In 2019, lightning strikes earlier than usual in the year caused a wildfire that raged for most of the summer, destroying 170,000 acres, in turn raising inland water temperatures, killing off fish.
That was a climate change signal that just screams volumes. We reached temperatures in these streams that were not forecasted till 2069. So we're 50 years ahead of where we should be. This is extraordinary. This is how quickly it's happening.
Just an hour outside of the state's largest city, Anchorage is one of the most visible signs of creeping change. 100 years ago, the Portage Glacier was right here on the very spot where I'm standing. In the 1980s, when they built this visitors centre, it had receded, but you could still see it. Today, you can't see it. It's receded even further and is now about 4 kilometres away, around the bend in that valley. Alaska has more glaciers than any other US state, but they're also fading faster here than in any other part of America. Some studies suggest they're melting 100 times quicker than previously thought and could lose up to 50% of their mass by the end of the century. But getting to Alaska's glaciers has never been easier, with helicopter tours landing directly on them. Locals say the Knik Glacier has receded 1 kilometre in just 15 years. Being able to get this close to the glacier is a fast-track way to get a front row seat to see the effects of climate change up close. But this kind of voyeuristic tourism poses a moral quandary for the industry and for tour guides like Haley Johnston.
There's a really depressing but immediate maybe boost to tourism, which is that fatalistic tourism. People want to see glaciers before they're gone.
Johnston runs week-long camping trips into backcountry Alaska.
You're walking through spongy tundra and it's wet, or you're crossing creeks like this.
But she knows air travel to and around the state only creates more greenhouse gases like CO2.
Travel is such a luxury and it's such a privilege. And I think it's really important for her opening our minds to things like climate change, right? Like if I can show someone glacial retreat in real time and in person, that's a really visceral thing for people to see. But then there's also a climatic impact of travel.
She offsets her carbon emissions to help with what she calls the climatic guilt of travel. But it is a balancing act of showing the problems while trying not to add to them, something Nicole Schmidt from the Alaska Wildlife Alliance knows well.
I believe in science, our organization believes in science, and the science tells us that big changes are coming and there's going to be a lot of heartache.
As we snowshoe across a frozen lake, she explains how preserving wildlife is hard in a state where the biggest revenue earner remains oil and gas. Economically, Alaska needs fossil fuels to survive, but ecologically, Alaska needs to wean itself off them to safeguard its future.
I think the time for us to keep our head in the sand and pretend that things are going along as normal has well passed, and so that's something we're really working on. It depends on what level you're looking at, but the state as a whole, I mean, our governor does not take in a really strong stance on climate change, and we have yet to see how the Biden administration incorporates their plans for climate change in Alaska.
Alaska's Republican governor sees the possibility of more renewable energy, but not at the expense of oil and gas.
To get the revenue to start to build that infrastructure for, quote, the new economy, you still have to work off of oil and gas. And for Alaska, we have a lot of oil and gas. And for us, this is an opportunity to put people to work, provide revenue for the state of Alaska, wealth for some of our support companies that support the oil industry. So what we'd like to see is a continuation of our oil and gas industry.
Climate change is literally reshaping Alaska. The people here are doing what they can to change that, because they know that their state, the last frontier, is at the front of the line, and drastic action is needed now to rewrite the future of the state. Meeting the people and seeing the work they're involved in, it's clear they're doing what they can, not to reverse climate change, but at least to slow it down.
You know, we're probably all doing our part, but overall it's going to take a lot more people than us to do something with climate change.
It means balancing the short-term needs of Alaskans with the long-term needs of Alaska. But just going with the flow is no longer an option.
Europe is planning a tidal wave of transformation of its buildings and homes to cut emissions, reduce energy poverty and help the continent become climate neutral by 2050. The bloc wants to double its rate of renovation, which currently stands at just 1% each year. But whilst the renovation wave is set to be an enormous challenge, there are hopes it will enhance the quality of life for people living in and using these buildings.
The beating heart of Paris is its architectural heritage. While its city streets lined with Haussmann-era buildings may be just as iconic as the Eiffel Tower, they were not built with energy efficiency in mind. These old buildings, many built more than 100 years ago, tend to be poorly insulated, releasing large amounts of heat. Local authorities here are working to change that. This housing block in the south of the city is in the process of a major energy efficiency renovation.
L'objectif de ces réhabilitations, c'est d'améliorer les immeubles au niveau thermique, d'améliorer aussi l'usage, c'est-à-dire de retrouver des volumes de pièces qui soient plus confortables pour nos locataires et d'améliorer bien sûr la thermique du logement, c'est-à-dire d'avoir un confort et des diminutions de charges pour les locataires.
It's forbidden to work on the outside of a 20th century heritage building like this one. So instead, the team are working inside, improving insulation using biosourced materials, replacing windows and decarbonising heating systems like boilers. Yvette Custis has lived in the block for more than a decade and is witnessing the transformation firsthand.
C'était très nécessaire de faire une réhabilitation parce que l'immeuble était vétuste, nous avions des problèmes d'humidité. Les locaux étaient quand même assez exigus, surtout des pièces humides.
But a deep internal renovation like this one is a major undertaking, and the project has meant the relocation of the majority of the building's residents. Many of them are elderly and have lived in the building for decades. Forcing people to give up affordable housing, a stone's throw from the famous Panthéon in the left bank, has not been easy.
Ça a été extrêmement délicat, effectivement, parce que les personnes âgées sont très attachées à leurs murs, c'est leur vie, on les arrache un petit peu à leur nid. Donc il a fallu en amont que l'on travaille avec Paris Habitat, en tant qu'amicale de locataires et notre gardienne, qui a été d'un grand secours pour motiver ces personnes âgées qui aussi nécessitaient éventuellement un relogement beaucoup plus adapté.
France has pledged to make all of its buildings energy efficient by 2050, but despite years of work on the issue, things are not moving quickly.
This building is already being renovated, but millions more across France need to be transformed. Nearly 1 in 6 people live in homes known as energy sieves, meaning they're either too hot or too cold, which adds considerably to France's carbon footprint.
It's a similar picture across Europe. The building stock is responsible for a third of the continent's greenhouse gas emissions. Tackling poor quality buildings and homes is seen as a critical part of tackling energy poverty and achieving carbon neutrality by 2050.
Energy poverty is a problem for over 30 million Europeans. So if we can reduce the amount of energy that they're using in their houses, we reduce their bills, and it's a real social benefit as well as environmental benefit.
The EU wants to transform 35 million existing buildings, including 800,000 in social housing. Funding will come through an investment plan attached to the bloc's post-pandemic recovery fund. The aim is to refurbish Europe's building infrastructure and fit it for the future, combining style with sustainability.
We know that the construction sector can even be turned from a carbon source into a carbon sink if organic building materials like wood and smart technologies like AI are being used. So I want Next Generation EU to kickstart a European renovation wave and make our union a leader in the circular economy.
The movement will look to emulate the carbon-saving ability of so-called passive houses, like this project in Frankfurt, social housing that is powered by renewable resources and efficiently insulated to drastically reduce energy demand. Public buildings like schools and hospitals are also set to be transformed. This swimming pool at the Free University in Brussels has been extensively renovated and is now known as the city's most sustainable pool. The facility produces 500 tonnes less CO2 a year than it did previously. By collecting and treating rain and wastewater, the pool also consumes 70% less water than an average public pool.
Due to the fact that we had an extra 2 million, we could invest it in a green roof, in circular build, in LED lighting, in the heat system of the air, in the heat system of the pool. It gave us an enormous opportunity to do that, to also gain not only in the build, but on the long term in the exploitation, because due to those sustainable investments, it costs less to have the pool open for public.
But while there is work underway, Europe's current rate of renovation of just 1% a year is only a third of what is needed to decarbonise its building stock to hit its climate targets. Industry experts are calling for countries to pick up the pace.
The EU has set targets to cut emissions by 55% by 2030. Some here in Brussels say part of achieving this is about toughening up regulation, setting clear guidelines for the renovation of Europe's worst performing buildings and incentivising building owners to carry out better quality work.
The European Commission is due to unveil its plans for minimum standards this year, which would set deadlines for building owners to make improvements by a specific date, such as a sale or a commercial rental. It's about ensuring the renovation work goes far enough. Studies suggest that existing work is delivering energy savings of as little as 9%. Analysts say the proper implementation of minimum standards is key to meeting climate goals.
They are a real opportunity. The minimum standards are a chance to tackle the worst performing buildings first, and we need to tackle those buildings first if we want to realistically reach our 2030 targets.
The renovation wave starts with a patchwork of projects like this one in Paris, and the scale of the challenge is immense. But the EU has made its plans for a sustainable future clear, and there are hopes this is just the beginning.